If everyone in the kingdom agrees that a girl deserves to be punished, does that make her guilty? The question would echo through the royal court for years, but on that cold autumn morning, no one seemed interested in the answer. They only wanted someone to blame. Evelyn Hart stood alone at the center of the great hall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her simple gray dress as hundreds of eyes fixed on her. Noblemen lined the marble chamber beneath towering banners embroidered with silver wolves, while ladies in jeweled gowns whispered behind gloved hands. None of them looked at her with kindness. None of them looked at her with doubt. They looked at her as though the verdict had already been decided. Evelyn lowered her gaze to the polished stone floor. She had spent nearly 6 years working in the palace, rising before sunrise to scrub corridors, polish silver, and carry endless trays through halls she was never meant to belong in. Most days, the nobles barely noticed her existence. Today, they remembered her name. And that frightened her more than anything. "The evidence is undeniable," Lord Whitmore declared from the council platform. His voice rolled across the hall like distant thunder. The royal seal disappeared during her shift. No one else had access. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Evelyn's stomach tightened. She had repeated the truth so many times that the words had lost meaning. She had never touched the seal. She had never even entered the chamber where it was kept. But truth seemed very small compared to the certainty filling the room. "She is an Omega servant," another noblewoman said sharply. "Why should we trust her word over the word of respected members of this court?" More nods followed. More agreement. Evelyn felt each one like another stone added to a weight already crushing her chest. She wanted to defend herself again. She wanted to speak louder. But she had learned long ago that people rarely listened to girls like her. At the back of the hall stood other servants. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked frightened. None stepped forward. They could not afford to. Standing beside Evelyn would only make them targets too. The council continued listing accusations. Missing records. Broken protocol. Suspicious timing. Every coincidence became proof. Every rumor became fact. And with each passing minute, the crowd grew more convinced that they had found the culprit responsible for the kingdom's latest scandal. Evelyn's throat tightened. This was how lives were ruined. Not by monsters or curses. By people deciding a story was true before hearing all of it. "Enough," Lord Whitmore finally announced. The hall fell silent. "The court recommends immediate dismissal from palace service and permanent banishment from royal grounds." Applause erupted from sections of the gallery. Evelyn felt her heart sink. This was it. Everything she had built would disappear before sunset. She blinked quickly, refusing to cry. They would not see her break. Then suddenly, the massive doors at the far end of the chamber opened. The sound echoed through the hall. Every voice stopped. Every head turned. Heavy footsteps crossed the marble floor. And for the first time that morning, fear appeared on the faces of the nobles themselves. The Alpha King had returned. The sound of those footsteps seemed to drain the confidence from every voice in the chamber. Evelyn looked up for the first time in several minutes and felt her breath catch. Alpha King Adrian Blackthorne moved through the great hall with the quiet certainty of a man who never needed to announce his authority. His black royal armor reflected the light of 1,000 candles. A dark red cloak flowed behind him, and the sword at his side reminded everyone present that he was not only their king but also the protector of the realm. The nobles lowered their heads. Even Lord Whitmore seemed less certain of himself. Adrian ascended the marble steps toward the royal throne without rushing. The silence deepened with every step. When he finally took his seat, his dark eyes swept across the hall. They paused briefly on Evelyn before moving on. The moment lasted only a second, yet something about it unsettled her. He had looked at her as though she were a person rather than a problem. "Continue," Adrian said. His voice was calm. Lord Whitmore cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the court has reached a recommendation regarding the servant Evelyn Hart." Adrian rested one arm on the throne. I heard the recommendation. The older noble hesitated. Then you agree that immediate dismissal is appropriate? The king did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the faces gathered before him. Evelyn noticed several council members suddenly avoiding eye contact. Tell me, Adrian finally said, how many witnesses saw Evelyn Hart take the royal seal? Lord Whitmore blinked. No one witnessed the act itself. Then how many witnesses saw her enter the chamber? Another pause. None, Your Majesty. A faint murmur traveled through the room. Adrian's expression never changed. Interesting. Lord Whitmore quickly recovered. The circumstances remain highly suspicious. Suspicion is not proof, Adrian replied. The words landed heavily across the hall. Evelyn felt her heart begin to beat faster. For the first time all morning, someone had spoken in her defense. The king turned his attention toward her. Look at me. Evelyn froze before slowly lifting her eyes. She had seen the Alpha King from a distance many times over the years. Never like this. Never with the attention of the entire kingdom fixed upon them. Did you take the royal seal? He asked. The question was simple. The answer came instantly. No, Your Majesty. Her voice sounded small in the enormous hall. Adrian continued watching her. And if I ordered a full investigation? You would find I am telling the truth. Gasps spread among the nobles. A servant speaking so directly to the king was almost unheard of. Yet Adrian seemed neither offended nor surprised. If anything, he appeared thoughtful. Lord Whitmore stepped forward. Your Majesty, surely one servant's claim cannot outweigh the judgment of the entire council. Adrian slowly rose from the throne. The movement alone silenced every whisper. That, he said quietly, is exactly what I intend to determine. Then he looked directly at Evelyn once more. Until I reach my own conclusion, Evelyn Hart remains under my protection. Across the hall, shock spread from face to face like a wave. And for the first time, Evelyn realized the people accusing her were suddenly far more afraid than she was. The meeting ended soon afterward, but the shock it created lingered long after the nobles left the great hall. Evelyn could feel their eyes following her as royal guards escorted her through the palace corridors. Not as prisoners were escorted, but not as honored guests either. She existed somewhere in between, protected by the king yet unwanted by nearly everyone else. The distinction did little to ease the knot in her stomach. Servants stopped working when she passed. Some looked relieved that she had not been cast out. Others looked nervous simply standing near her. Rumors traveled faster than winter winds in the royal palace. By sunset, every kitchen, stable, and servant hall would know that the Alpha King had personally intervened on behalf of an Omega servant accused by the court. No one would understand why. Truthfully, neither did Evelyn. She was led to a small guest chamber on the eastern side of the palace. The room was modest compared to those reserved for nobility, but far grander than the narrow servant quarters she had called home for years. A fireplace glowed softly in one corner. Fresh blankets rested upon a neatly prepared bed. A tray of warm food waited on a table beside the window. Evelyn stared at it all in confusion. This was not protection. This felt dangerously close to kindness. After the guards left, she moved toward the window overlooking the palace gardens. The sun was disappearing beyond the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Normally she loved this view. Tonight it only reminded her how quickly life could change. That morning she had expected to lose everything. Now she was living under the king's protection. The difference felt unreal. A knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened before she could answer. An older woman stepped inside carrying several folded documents. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her dark blue uniform identified her as one of the royal administrators. Miss Hart, the woman said politely. His Majesty has ordered a full review of the accusations against you. Evelyn swallowed. Did he say why? The woman hesitated. The king rarely explains his decisions. That answer somehow made everything more mysterious. The administrator placed the documents on the table. You will remain here until the investigation concludes. Evelyn nodded. Thank you. After the woman departed, silence returned. Hours passed. The palace gradually settled into its evening routines. Yet Evelyn found herself unable to rest. Questions circled endlessly through her mind. Why had the king believed her? Why challenge his own counsel for someone as insignificant as her? Most importantly, what would happen if the investigation uncovered nothing? Just after nightfall, another knock sounded at her door. This time a young palace messenger entered. He appeared nervous. Miss Hart, he said carefully. His Majesty requests your presence tomorrow morning. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. For what purpose? The messenger shook his head. I was not told. He quickly departed, leaving her alone once more. Evelyn looked toward the dark window where her reflection stared back at her. Somewhere inside the palace, the most powerful man in the kingdom had decided she deserved a second chance. But as she stood there beneath the moonlight, she could not shake the feeling that the investigation was only the beginning. Because hidden somewhere within the palace walls was the person truly responsible for the missing royal seal. And if that person had been willing to frame an Omega servant once, there was no reason to believe they would stop now. The following morning arrived gray and cold, with low clouds hanging over the palace towers like a warning. Evelyn barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the nobles who had demanded her punishment. Yet none of those memories troubled her as much as a single question. Why had the Alpha King chosen to protect her? A servant arrived shortly after sunrise and escorted her through a series of hallways she had never entered before. These corridors belonged to the royal wing, a place where servants like Evelyn rarely set foot unless summoned. The floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Tall windows overlooked gardens touched by autumn frost. Everywhere she looked, signs of wealth and power surrounded her. She felt more out of place with every step. Eventually they stopped before a pair of carved oak doors. The servant bowed slightly before opening them. His Majesty will see you now. Evelyn stepped inside. The room beyond was surprisingly simple. Shelves filled with books lined the walls. Maps covered a large table near the fireplace. Instead of sitting upon a throne, Adrian Blackthorne stood beside a window studying reports spread across a desk. For a moment he looked less like a king and more like a man carrying responsibilities no one else could understand. When he noticed her, he set the papers aside. Miss Hart. Evelyn lowered her head respectfully. Your Majesty. Adrian gestured toward a chair. Sit. She hesitated before obeying. Her hands folded tightly in her lap. The king remained standing for several seconds, studying her with quiet concentration. It was not an uncomfortable look. It was simply unusual. Most nobles looked at her and immediately decided what she was worth. Adrian seemed to be searching for something else entirely. Tell me about the day the seal disappeared, he said. Evelyn blinked. This was not what she expected. She carefully described her schedule from beginning to end. The laundry deliveries. The inventory lists. The hours spent organizing supplies in the western storage rooms. Adrian listened without interrupting. Occasionally he asked small questions. Nothing felt accusatory. If anything, it felt as though he genuinely wanted the truth. Nearly half an hour passed before he finally nodded. Your account matches several statements already collected. Evelyn stared at him. Then why does the council still believe I am guilty? A faint shadow crossed Adrian's expression. Because people often prefer convenient answers over difficult truths. The words settled heavily between them. Evelyn understood exactly what he meant. The king moved toward the window again. Someone wanted the investigation to end quickly. Why? She asked quietly. Adrian looked out toward the gardens below. That is what I intend to discover. Before Evelyn could respond, Sharp knock interrupted them. One of the royal guards entered carrying a sealed document. The guard handed it directly to the king. Adrian opened it and began reading. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression hardened. Not with anger. With concern. Evelyn felt unease crawl through her chest. Something had changed. Adrian lowered the document slowly. It appears, he said, that another piece of evidence has surfaced. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Against me? The king looked directly at her. His silence lasted only a second, but it was long enough to make her heart race. That, he replied, is exactly what someone wants us to believe. After leaving the king's study, Evelyn found herself thinking less about the new evidence and more about the strange certainty in Adrian's voice. He had not sounded like a man searching for someone to blame. He had sounded like a man searching for someone hidden. That thought followed her throughout the day. The palace seemed different now. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. Servants exchanged nervous glances. Nobles who once ignored her now watched her with open suspicion. Yet beneath all of it, Evelyn sensed something else. Fear. Someone inside the palace had expected the investigation to end quickly. Someone had expected her to disappear before questions were asked. That evening, unable to quiet her thoughts, she wandered into a small garden tucked behind the eastern wing. It had always been one of her favorite places. Few people visited it because the pathways were narrow and the flowers grew wild rather than orderly. Evelyn sat beside a stone fountain and listened to the gentle sound of water. For the first time in days, she felt able to breathe. Memories drifted back to her childhood. Her father had worked among the royal horses until illness took him away. Her mother had passed years earlier. Since then, Evelyn had learned not to expect protection from anyone. Life became simpler when you assumed you were on your own. That was why the king's actions unsettled her so deeply. She did not understand kindness from powerful people. A voice interrupted her thoughts. You always come here when you are worried. Evelyn looked up in surprise. Standing at the entrance of the garden was Martha, an elderly palace seamstress who had known her for years. Relief softened Evelyn's expression. I did not realize anyone noticed. Martha smiled gently. More people notice you than you think. The older woman sat beside her. For a while neither spoke. Then Martha sighed. You should know that not everyone believes the accusations. Evelyn stared at the fountain. It does not feel that way. Because the loudest voices are rarely the kindest. The words reminded Evelyn of something Adrian might say. Before she could respond, Martha reached into her pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. I found this near the Western Records room yesterday. Evelyn accepted it carefully. Her pulse quickened. The paper contained part of an inventory schedule. At first glance it seemed ordinary. Then she noticed a familiar signature at the bottom. Her eyes widened. The name belonged to a noble administrator who had testified against her during the hearing. More importantly, the document placed him near the restricted archive on the very day the seal vanished. This cannot be right, Evelyn whispered. Martha nodded slowly. That is what I thought too. Evelyn stared at the paper. For the first time, she held something that raised questions about someone else. Someone powerful. Someone respected. Someone the court would never suspect. A cold realization settled over her. If this information reached the wrong person, it might disappear just as quickly as the royal seal itself. And somewhere inside the palace, the true culprit was beginning to realize that Evelyn Hart was no longer standing alone. The next morning, Evelyn carried the folded document hidden inside the sleeve of her dress as though it were made of glass. Every step through the palace felt heavier than the last. She understood something now that she had not understood before. The accusations against her had never been random. Someone had needed a convenient target. Someone had counted on the fact that an Omega servant would be easy to sacrifice. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it made her determined. For years she had endured whispers, dismissive glances, and the quiet assumption that people like her did not matter. Now, for the first time, she possessed a piece of the puzzle. She only needed to place it in the right hands. By mid-morning, she was summoned once again to the king's study. The familiar room felt slightly less intimidating than before, though her heart still raced when she entered. Adrian stood beside the large table covered in reports and maps. Several advisors were present as well, but they quickly departed at a signal from the king, leaving Evelyn alone with him. "You wished to see me, Your Majesty?" she asked. Adrian studied her carefully. "Actually, I was beginning to think you wished to see me." Evelyn froze. For a brief moment she wondered if he somehow knew about the document. Then the king's gaze dropped to her sleeve. "You have been carrying something important since sunrise." Heat rushed to her face. Slowly, she removed the folded paper and placed it on the table. Adrian unfolded it and read the contents in silence. As his eyes moved across the page, a thoughtful expression appeared. "Where did you get this?" "Martha found it near the records room," Evelyn explained. "She believed I should see it." Adrian nodded. "A wise decision." He examined the signature again. "Lord Harrison testified against you during the hearing." "I know. And according to this schedule, he was much closer to the restricted archive than he claimed." Evelyn watched him carefully. "Does that mean he is responsible?" Adrian folded the document. "It means someone lied." The answer was frustratingly incomplete, yet Evelyn understood why he was cautious. Accusations alone had nearly destroyed her life. Evidence mattered. Truth mattered. The king walked toward the window overlooking the palace grounds. "There is something else you should know." His tone changed. Evelyn immediately sensed the seriousness in it. "Another witness came forward this morning." Hope flickered inside her chest. "A witness?" Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "The witness claims to have seen someone entering the archive shortly before the seal disappeared." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Then they can clear my name." For the first time, uncertainty crossed the king's face. "Perhaps." The single word chilled her more than any winter wind. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Adrian looked directly at her. "The witness vanished before investigators could speak with them." Silence filled the room. Evelyn felt her hope falter. Someone inside the palace was moving faster than they were. Someone was watching every development and responding before the truth could surface. And as Adrian returned the document to her, both of them understood the same unsettling reality. The conspiracy inside the palace was far larger than either of them had imagined. For the next several days, the palace seemed to exist beneath a cloud of uncertainty. Investigators moved quietly through offices and archives. Servants whispered in corners. Nobles watched one another with increasing suspicion. Yet despite all the effort, the truth remained frustratingly out of reach. Evelyn spent much of her time in the Eastern Wing, waiting for news that never seemed to arrive. The waiting was almost worse than the accusations. At least when she had been standing before the court, she knew what everyone thought of her. Now she was trapped between fear and hope, uncertain which one would win. Late one afternoon, a royal messenger arrived with an unexpected request. The king wanted her to accompany him to the palace records hall. The summons surprised her. Since the investigation began, Adrian had rarely involved her directly. Curious and nervous, she followed the messenger through a maze of corridors until she reached one of the oldest sections of the palace. The records hall was enormous. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, holding documents that chronicled generations of royal history. Adrian stood near a large table covered with ledgers and reports. "Your Majesty," Evelyn said as she approached. Adrian nodded. "I need your help identifying something." He slid a stack of inventory records toward her. These documents were altered. Evelyn frowned and examined the pages. At first everything appeared normal. Then she noticed subtle inconsistencies. Dates had been adjusted. Storage. Assignments had been changed. Entire entries had been rewritten. Someone wanted certain movements inside the palace hidden, she said quietly. Adrian looked almost pleased. That is what I concluded as well. Evelyn blinked. Then why ask me? The king leaned against the table. Because you noticed it in less than 2 minutes. My advisors spent 3 days studying these records and missed the same details. The compliment caught her completely off guard. No noble had ever praised her intelligence before. Most barely acknowledged she possessed any. Evelyn lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. Adrian continued examining the documents. You pay attention to things others overlook. The words lingered in her mind long after he spoke them. For years she had believed her careful observations were simply part of surviving palace life. She had never considered they might have value. Together they continued sorting through records. As evening approached, a pattern slowly emerged. Several altered documents connected to the same group of officials. More importantly, every trail seemed to lead toward a restricted treasury archive that few people could access. Adrian studied the names in silence. Interesting, he murmured. What is it? Evelyn asked. The king hesitated. Every person connected to these records belongs to a faction that opposed my reforms last year. Evelyn felt a chill. This was no longer about a missing seal. Politics. Power. Influence. The conspiracy was becoming something much larger. Before she could ask another question, a folded letter was delivered by one of the royal guards. Adrian opened it and read the contents. His expression darkened immediately. What happened? Evelyn asked. The king handed her the letter. Her eyes widened as she read. A formal petition had been submitted to the royal council. Dozens of powerful nobles were demanding that the investigation end immediately. And for the second time, they were demanding that Evelyn Hart be removed from the palace. The petition spread through the palace faster than any official announcement. By the following morning, everyone knew that a powerful group of nobles had united against the investigation. They claimed the kingdom needed stability. They claimed the accusations against Evelyn had already been proven. But beneath their carefully chosen words, Evelyn sensed desperation. The closer the investigation moved toward the truth, the louder their demands became. That realization frightened her more than the petition itself. She spent the morning reviewing records with Adrian and several trusted investigators. Every new document revealed another inconsistency. Missing reports. Altered schedules. Conflicting testimonies. None of it proved who had taken the royal seal, yet together they painted a troubling picture. Someone inside the court had been manipulating information for months. This was organized, Evelyn said quietly as she studied another ledger. Adrian nodded. Much more organized than I originally believed. Before either could continue, a royal guard entered carrying an urgent summons. The council had called an emergency assembly. Attendance by the king was required. Evelyn immediately recognized what it meant. The nobles were no longer willing to wait. Less than an hour later, the great hall filled once again. The atmosphere felt different from the first hearing. Then, the nobles had been confident. Now, they seemed determined. Dozens of influential figures stood united beneath the royal banners. When Adrian entered, every eye followed him. Evelyn remained near the back of the chamber under royal protection, aware that many hostile glances were directed her way. Lord Whitmore stepped forward first. Your Majesty, this matter has dragged on long enough. The kingdom deserves resolution. Several nobles voiced their agreement. Another council member added, the continued presence of this servant within the palace has become a source of division. Evelyn lowered her gaze. Hearing herself discussed as though she were not present never became easier. Adrian remained seated upon the throne, calm and unreadable. Continue, he said. Lord Whitmore drew a breath. We formally request that Evelyn Hart be removed from royal protection while the investigation proceeds. A murmur of approval swept through the hall. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. Without the king's protection, she would be vulnerable once again. The council knew it. Adrian knew it. Everyone in the room understood exactly what was being requested. For several seconds, the king said nothing. The silence stretched across the chamber. Some nobles appeared hopeful. Others appeared nervous. Finally Adrian stood. The movement immediately silenced every whisper. His dark gaze swept across the assembly. You ask me to remove protection from the one person who has consistently cooperated with this investigation. No one answered. You ask me to trust officials whose statements continue to contradict documented records. The hall grew even quieter. Then Adrian took a single step forward. Tell me, he said, why are so many of you afraid of a servant? The question struck the chamber like lightning. Faces stiffened. Eyes shifted. No one had an answer prepared. And as Evelyn watched the confidence drain from several powerful nobles, she realized something important. For the first time since the accusations began, the people who had targeted her were losing control of the story. The silence that followed the king's question lingered long after the council meeting ended. No noble stepped forward with an answer because none existed that would survive the truth. Over the next several days, the investigation accelerated. Documents hidden in forgotten archives were recovered. Testimonies were reviewed again. Records once dismissed as insignificant suddenly revealed connections no one could ignore. One by one, the carefully constructed accusations against Evelyn began to unravel. Then, on a bright autumn morning, the entire court was summoned to the Great Hall. The announcement spread through the palace within minutes. Servants paused their work. Advisors abandoned meetings. Nobles arrived in elaborate attire, each eager to learn the outcome. Evelyn stood near the front of the chamber, her hands trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. She had spent weeks carrying the weight of suspicion. Now everything would finally be decided. When Adrian entered, the room fell silent. He crossed the hall with the same steady confidence he always carried, then stopped before the throne. A royal archivist stepped forward holding a collection of recovered records. The evidence was presented carefully and methodically. Altered schedules. False reports. Hidden transactions. Most importantly, proof that several officials had manipulated documents to conceal their own activities inside the restricted archive. None of it pointed to Evelyn. In fact, every new discovery proved she could not have committed the crime she had been accused of. Murmurs spread across the hall. Faces that once looked at her with certainty now showed embarrassment and disbelief. Lord Whitmore remained silent. So did many of the nobles who had demanded her removal. At last the archivist finished speaking. The hall waited. Adrian's gaze moved across the assembled court before settling on Evelyn. The investigation is complete, he said. Evelyn Hart is innocent of every accusation made against her. The words echoed through the chamber. For a moment Evelyn could not breathe. Weeks of fear, humiliation, and uncertainty seemed to lift from her shoulders all at once. Yet Adrian was not finished. More than that, he continued, she demonstrated honesty, courage, and loyalty while others attempted to protect themselves through deception. The king descended the steps from the throne platform. Every eye followed him. He stopped directly beside Evelyn. The gesture alone sent a wave of shock through the crowd. Many of you judged her because of her station, Adrian said. You assumed a servant was easier to blame than questioning those who held power. No one challenged him. No one dared. The king extended his hand toward Evelyn. Slowly, uncertainly, she accepted it. The value of a person is not determined by title, wealth, or bloodline, Adrian declared. It is determined by character. And in recent weeks, Evelyn Hart has shown more character than many who sit upon this council. The hall remained silent, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer filled with suspicion. It was filled with recognition. For the first time since she entered the palace years ago, people were truly seeing her. And as Evelyn looked across the chamber, she realized that the girl everyone had once dismissed had become the one person the entire kingdom would remember.